Any questions about that or about the exam? I mean, the midterm? No, we good? All right. Let's roll. Okay, these are our key concepts for today. Probably the first two is what I'm going to do today. Did I do agenda? Let's do agenda first. Yeah, agenda, yeah. So today and then Wednesday. Today we're going to talk about, I guess more broadly, the week is about, what is hip-hop authenticity? Why is it such a big deal? Why does it matter in hip-hop? That'll carry through to both days. And today we're focusing on a number of concepts, developing on what we've been talking about, concept of race, culture, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to expand on that today, and from the vantage of cultural studies. And then on Wednesday, we'll go into some more specifics from the readings that we did. We'll have more questions about the readings that we did for this week. And we're going to consider competing versions or alternate versions of hip-hop authenticity. So basically the idea with respect to hip-hop authenticity, we're going to talk about the way that it's been critiqued, the way it's been problematized in the readings that you did. And then what are the ways in which I think are downplayed but somewhat touched upon in the readings, what are the senses in which hip-hop authenticity can be a good thing? Or why is it so important to hip-hoppers in a positive sense from the vantage of social justice, when we're interested in social justice? Why is it an important concept? So that's sort of the outline of why we're talking about authenticity in hip-hop. So let's take a minute, let's do attendance and our top hat questions, and then we'll get into the lecture. I'll pull up our key concepts while we're doing that. So I'm going to focus on the first half, race versus ethnicity, and then definitions of culture today. And we'll see how much I get into with respect to the specific topic for the week, and that will carry over into Wednesday. Yeah, how about we get going? Minimize, keep open, makes sense. And let's go ahead. Uh-oh, what happened here? This looks weird. Let me see the question set. Maybe this is the... Can you come out of here for a second?
Okay. Oh, and here?
Yeah, I think you might be on the wrong presentation. Six, yeah, but it's 2018. Scroll up. Scroll up. Scroll. Here. Here.
You're good.
Yeah. No, but click on that. And present the folder. I think you got to close the other one. You got to close the other one and present this one. My fault, I had a folder with the 2017 questions. These are the 2018 questions. That's what it was, right? Yeah. to the dealership, but you never caught nothing. You ain't got nothing. Oh, wow. Split in the middle. Okay. Wait. 50 represents realness as about, oh, this maybe not split. Maybe this is one where there's two right answers. 50 Cent represents realness individual. Jeru, realness is collective. Okay. All the above. That doesn't seem very logical. All right, let's see what we got. Yeah. Oh, 60. Why only 60? Because people didn't pick both. Okay. Because people chose one and not the other. Oh, wait, scroll up. Multiple answers, no. All the way up. Multiple answers are accepted for this question. So people didn't read the fine print. I think that's what happened. Is that what happened? I think, yeah. I mean, that's what I'm guessing, is that people didn't click on both of those answers. So I've said before that that will matter. And here's the time when it did. I see a lot of long faces. But it was an easy question, right? Read the whole question carefully. Let's go to the next one. Don't get it confused, let it get it embedded, set it in the rhetoric used. So in class, when we're talking, also when you are writing your discussion posts, I prefer that you write N-word or say N-word in class. Other than if it's in quotes, quoting a title, quoting a song in writing. Is this a hard one? They have the CD, they have the lyrics. Should be easy, but I'm sensing some difficulty. All right. Replace the N-word with the greatness deserved. Okay, all the above. Okay. Interesting. Well, 44 people put all the above. Okay. All right. It's an attractive option. We can show percentages and stuff. All right, let's just see the answer. Let's get going. Hey, it's a tough day. Today's a rough day. Sorry guys, I didn't think it was going to be so tough. I thought about eliminating. When I read this over, I'm like, maybe I should just take out the last two answers and make it easier. But I didn't. Oh yeah, that's the reminder that we should mute our phones in class. Thank you for saying that aloud. All right, let's get into the lecture. Oh, my office room. Okay, cool. Anytime you guys want to contest the questions, if you think they were unfair, if you think I was wrong, that's what office hours are for. You can come and debate. You know, it's not impossible to beat me in a debate, just highly improbable, but it is possible. It's happened in history. Okay, so one of the key things, so what did I say? We're going to talk about race versus ethnicity, culture, and then we'll see if we get to the other stuff. The rap authenticity versus hip-hop authenticity, and this concept of strategic essentialism, which is going to be building off the concept of racial essentialism, which I think we discussed in a previous class. Do we have any questions where we are right now? Any questions about the top hat stuff? We good? Okay, let's get rolling. So you guys know that race and ethnicity are often used interchangeably, right? Sometimes people say one when they mean the other. Sometimes people think about them as the same thing. Sometimes we move from talking about one to the other. And there's both good and bad reasons for that. Sometimes the same signifier, such as blackness, can mean both race and ethnicity in different contexts. Other times, it's Other times, people are talking about ethnicity to avoid talking about race. There's lots of different ways people try to avoid talking about race, and talking about ethnicity is one technique of doing it. That's not always what's happening, but that sometimes is one of the more problematic things. But it's problematic that they are used synonymously, that they are used interchangeably from my perspective, for the reasons that I've put up here. Ethnic identities arise from different historical processes than racial identities, right? We've talked about how racial categories, despite how we are socialized into imagining them as inherent properties of our bodies or inherent properties of our heritage or something like that, what they really are is colonial subjectivities. It's identities, it's group identities that have been historically constructed through European imperialism, transatlantic slave trade, global expansionism, these historical processes through modernity, basically capitalism and slavery. And some broader things, but these are the basic ones certainly that create our concepts of blackness and whiteness. Whereas ethnic identities, ethnicities, so there was a time in the world, on the planet Earth, when there was no concept of race, before modernity, before these processes that I just mentioned. But there were ethnicities, right? Ethnicities are, I'm going to tell you on the next slide what ethnicities are. Members of a given race belong to many different ethnicities. Here's what I want to point out, in many different cultures, right? So even though sometimes we talk about, black culture, we'll talk about Latino or Latinx culture, but people who are grouped into or ascribed a particular racial identity, in fact, in reality, share many different cultures, right? They don't share one culture. Whereas generally ethnicities, ethnicity is generally used to refer to groups that are comprised, who self-identify by that ethnic moniker, and who identify with each other based on shared cultural traditions. And this is my definition of race, which comes from this article. Races are colonial subjectivities reified as inherent identities. I haven't given you that definition before, but I've outlined the argument for why we should think of race in that way, and it's been in the previous readings that we did, such as the Toure and Hamilton reading, right? So they said that the association of race with color is merely incidental. If you recall when you read that chapter 1 from the book Black Power, really what race has to do with is the imposition of power we talked about. And I think people were familiar with the idea that contrary to the lexical logic of the terms race and racism, right? Because in terms of the logic, the semantic logic of race and racism, you would think that race would need to predate racism. But in fact, the argument in cultural studies, in critical race theory, is that in fact, racism predates race. Racism explains race. Defined is the reason why race is invented. And it's invented as a justification for the relations of subjugation that were implemented through colonialism and slavery. And one of the most fundamental texts, one of the earliest or most important texts to give this argument is Eric Williams. I think it might have been cited in the Toure and Hamilton reading. Eric Williams, who was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad, wrote a famous book called Capitalism and Slavery, and he gave this argument. So races are colonial subjectivities reified as inherent identities. I hope that even though these are some big words here, it's clear based on the lecturing that I've been giving you, but I'll point out, maybe I haven't defined the word reified, which of course you could Google, but it just means sort of, when something is reified, it's sort of solidified, it's sort of crystallized, concretized in that way. So races, so to say that races are colonial subjectivities means that it's these subjectivities, subject positions, identities, you could just say identities, that are created through the process of the imposition of domination, right? So the colonized colonizes the colonized. Does that make sense? The colonizer colonizes the colonized. And so this power differential is created, and that's clearly a political relationship. That's clearly a contingent relationship. It could be otherwise. It's not inherent. It's not inborn. It's nothing to do with biology. It's nothing to do with culture. Has to do with domination. Has to do with power, subjugation. But so those relationships are set up through violence, and then they are reified as inherent identities, meaning that differential position of power is reimagined, is reproduced, is represented is represented as if it is something inherent about the identities of these different groups, right? So as if it had nothing to do with power, as if it has nothing to do with subjugation, as if it has something to do with the way people look or their culture or something that, puts them in this group. So that's the idea there. And that's different than ethnicities, right? Ethnicities, races are, these racial groupings are something that has been ascribed, that has been imposed through these historical processes. Sometimes ethnic identities are also ascribed or put onto a group which they later adopt. But generally, when we think of ethnic identities and the terms, certainly the terms that define ethnicities, they come from within the culture. It's the people who name themselves whatever that ethnicity is, and they share a particular culture. Now, on the concept of culture, some of this is a restatement of what I said. Shared ethnicities generally include shared culture. Races, I put in brackets empirically. Race empirically does not. And I think, complication shouldn't be here. I got complication on the next slide. So what else do I want to say about culture? More accurately, regionally specific. Do I have that on the next slide? Yeah, okay. So, I'm re-emphasizing what I said on the previous slide. Forget about this complication, that's the next slide. I'm just emphasizing again that generally speaking, ethnicity is something that is self-named in terms of when we're speaking etymologically, when we're speaking where the ethnic name comes about, and there's generally a shared culture. And that's not necessarily the case with race. But there are some complications, right? It's not so cut and dried. Why? Because ethnicity also very often, probably the majority of the time, includes not just this idea of shared culture, but also this notion of shared lineage, right? And so that makes it much easier to conflate with the concept of race, which even though, if we understand race as a social construct, we understand that really what defines you as one race as opposed to another, the way that race is ascribed to you, having nothing to do with your self-identification or your culture, right? Or how you've been raised or your worldview or whatever. Generally, race is imposed on us, and it's imposed on us supposedly because of our lineage, but in fact because of a category that has been created and is perpetually recreated through these systems of power, right? And the reason why I'll argue to you, it's hard to say, yeah, but still, isn't it lineage? The reason why I'll argue to you, try to make it clear that it's not lineage, even though it's presented that way, is because of the fact, as I think I've discussed in previous lectures, there are different discursive frames in different countries, right? In different parts of the world that are defining race differently. So certain people can go from one country to another, and you would be in one racial category, in one discursive frame, right, in one socio-historical context, which is contemporary right now, and then you go to another country, and different races ascribe to you. It doesn't matter what you say, doesn't matter the claims you make about your ancestry. They say, no, well, this is what you actually are, right? Your lineage hasn't changed, right? Your heritage hasn't changed, but you've gone into a different context where they're defining race differently. But despite that reality, that's not how people think about it. People think about it as shared lineage, right? This is the lie that is presented to us. That's the reified inherent identity that I mentioned on the previous slide. So because it's thought of in that way, the fact that ethnicity also is thought of in terms of lineage helps create that confusion. All right, and then the other complication, the other reason for the confusion, as I mentioned, is that the same signifier in different contexts, depending on what you're talking about, depending on what you mean at a given time, and this is true of lots of different things, right? Lots of times a given word means something different in a different context. So a particular signifier or identity marker can refer to ethnicity in certain contexts and race in another context, right? So speaking about blackness as an example, in the US and elsewhere, it can function as both, as one or the other. And so this, when people aren't recognizing the way that blackness can mean both, does mean both these things in different conversations, then people can talk at what's called talking at cross purposes, right? When you have two different definitions or two different base assumptions in mind, and you're in a discussion with somebody or an argument with somebody, but even if you're in like a goodwill discussion with another person and you don't realize that you are thinking of a concept in a particular way, which is a legitimate way of thinking about it, it's a common way of thinking about it, it's a defensible way of thinking about it, and they might also be thinking about the word in a different way, which is also a defensible, a common way of using the word, but you have these different assumptions about it, and so you can get into this argument where you really are butting heads and not realizing that you don't have a fundamental disagreement. You're thinking about the word with two different, equally legitimate definitions, right? So this can happen a lot. But let me flesh this out, what I mean by blackness operating in these two different ways, right? If it isn't obvious. So, when we think of race, if we're thinking of race as a global construct, right, the global color line as Du Bois defined it, then people all across the world of African descent are understood to be black. Doesn't matter what African country you're from, in the words of Peter Tosh, no matter where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. Very androcentric, right? Male-centered. But this idea that black people can come from anywhere in the world, can be anywhere in the world. The diaspora is created through the transatlantic slave trade. There are people everywhere who are black. People in Africa are not more or less black than people in the Americas in this sense of the term, right? And they don't necessarily share any particular culture in common, right? Rather, as I mentioned on a previous slide, there are innumerable ethnicities that fall under this umbrella of blackness, this conception of blackness. And this, of course, applies to whiteness as well, with maybe some caveats, but certainly the point that all people who are designated whites anywhere in the world do not necessarily, well, let me take out the necessarily, do not in fact share a culture that you could identify, right? They don't share, a whole bunch of assumptions or language or, way of living, right? None of those things, right? What they share is a global identity construct which is created vis-a-vis blackness, right? And that's also what black people share across the world, right? Is they share this identity construct which has been created throughout modernity through the processes I mentioned relative to whiteness, right? They're co-constructs. Conversely, what do we mean when I'm saying that blackness also functions as an ethnicity? So I've defined ethnicity as these notions of shared lineage and shared culture, right? So we often, and this was addressed in your, in the reading that you did, there's these fraught debates about what is and is not black that happen in the US and beyond. What is and is not black, what is and is not black culture. But in reality, of course, black culture is local. The sort of the lived empirical black culture is local to a given black community or given black communities, right? So we say, the black community. It's a common thing to say, the black community. Very often this is bounded by, United States borders. And the assumption is that there is this shared black culture. And certainly in some ways there's lots of cultural references that are. But black culture, as you probably know, has its specificities on the East Coast versus the West Coast, the North versus the South. The Midwest culture is different, right? Midwest hip-hop has its sounds. So rather than it being one culture, right, there's multiple cultures. And these cultures don't, despite the fact that we're taught to think about these things boxed inside national borders, they exceed national borders, right? They cut across national borders. This applies, I was talking to you before about how this applies, certainly in Africa and anywhere in the world where the countries have been divided up according to colonial imperatives, but not in accordance with the ethnicities that existed, right? The nations that existed there prior to that. So you have all kinds of sort of ethnic borders that cut across national borders, and this is true in the U.S. as well, right? So black Canadian culture shares a lot in common with black American culture, and but it shares a lot in common with a particular kind of black American culture, right? And this is something even those of us who are raised in that culture don't necessarily recognize. So for instance, I'm from Toronto. I'm raised in, around, by, largely by black culture, lots of other cultural influences as well, but largely in black culture. And we sort of imagine black culture as this kind of monolithic thing. But really, our Torontonian black culture is heavily influenced by Caribbean culture, and is heavily influenced by East Coast black culture, U.S. East Coast black culture, because there's a lot of movement back and forth from New York to Toronto. So our black culture is heavily inflected and shares a lot of signification, of music, of style with New York culture, right? So we're imagining, in Toronto, me as a teenager, the other people who are sort of, participating in these cultural tropes, are imagining our culture as the same as black American culture. But what we are not recognizing when we think that way is what I just mentioned previously, is that throughout the US there's very different ideas of what counts as black culture, right? So West Coast black culture historically has been very different, right? Let me just mention this even though it's not on the slide, but it connects with what I'm saying right now. When we start in the second half of the semester, which is about to begin, after the midterm, when we take this globally, we're talking about global hip hop. One trope that repeats over and over in the literature is this idea that hip hop originates in the US and it's part of American culture, right? Usually, and this is one of the problems too with this global literature, is the African American specificity of hip hop gets lost in a lot of this literature, a lot of this discourse. But the idea is that hip hop in the US, hip hop begins in the US, and then wherever else it is in the world, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in different countries in Africa, whether that's in Asia, China, wherever, the new community, the young people that adopt it, they go through these phases where first they're mimicking American culture, and then they're sort of adapting it, and then they sort of make it their own. This is the way a lot of the literature talks about it. And it's depicted in this very like derogatory way. I don't know if derogatory is the right word, but I'm going to say derogatory. Derogatory way where that first stage of mimicry is inauthentic. Talking about authenticity, right? So that first stage, let's say, you know, rappers in Senegal, which is, you guys know, this is where I do most of my research in Africa, right? So that first stage in 1988 and the early 90s, when the Senegalese rappers are getting these cultural objects, these cultural products from the US, and they're checking out the breakdance and they're trying to rap and stuff like that, the hip hop that they're doing is seen as mimicry and therefore seen as inauthentic. Then they go through these stages where they make it sort of authentically their own. And there's a good reason why this is the general frame in how it's thought. But the essentialism that I want to bring your attention to relative to this lecture here is how national borders are being essentialized. So the assumption is that hip-hop is this American thing. It belongs to America. It really is American. If you are American, then you have the right to do hip-hop. If you are American, you are authentically hip-hop. And then when you are African, it is not authentic. It's only mimicry until you do something different. You put in your own language, you know, you do whatever, right? So what's the problem there? The problem is in the assumption that from outside the US, you imagine, or these authors imagine, that hip-hop is monolithically American, right? But when you're inside the United States, you don't have that illusion, because you know that that sort of circle that surrounds who gets to be authentically hip-hop and who doesn't get to be authentically hip-hop doesn't include everybody who's American, right? It's drawn along all these different kinds of lines. You could do your Venn diagram, right? It's racially circumscribed, it's class circumscribed, it's got problematic gender circumscription around it, and it's geographically circumscribed. So if you study the origins of West Coast hip-hop, the originators of West Coast hip-hop, and specifically of gangster rap, like Ice-T, like NWA, when they started out rapping in the early 80s, hip-hop wasn't considered as American black culture the way it is now. Hip-hop was considered East Coast black culture. Before that, it was considered Bronx black culture, right? The Bronx, there's the, you know, KRS-One's first hit single is South Bronx, South Bronx. And it was a battle record against people from Queens who were claiming that hip-hop had something to do with Queens, right? According to KRS, he said that MC Shan suggested that hip-hop started in the Bronx, in Queens. And so he's like, no, hip-hop is a Bronx thing, right? But it expands, people adopt it, people, here's the key word for next week, right? People appropriate it, right? So it originates in the Bronx. Black and brown people in the Bronx originated, and then it is appropriated by their peers in other boroughs in New York. And initially, there is resistance to that appropriation. Initially, there is tension over, like, is it appropriate for them to appropriate, right? You hear where I'm going, right? You can imagine where I'm going with this, right? So at a particular historical moment, it seems obvious that a given culture belongs to certain people. We can see those people, we can name those people, we know who it belongs to. But the borders of culture, like the borders of identity, are fluid in ways that we don't see and are political in ways that we don't see. And that's the power of ideology, is to hide those politics from us, right? But it's always this contestation over rights, opportunities, and resources, who has the right to this culture, who has the right to these resources, who has the right to these materials, and when other people take them on, how is that changing the way rights, opportunities, and resources, notice now I'm framing it in the language of social justice, right? How does that change the way rights, opportunities, and resources are distributed through these cultural materials? Okay, so when blackness operates as an ethnicity in the US, you have ideas about, what constitutes black culture. Black culture is like, we talk this certain way, we move this certain way, we dress this certain way, right? But it turns, and when you're enmeshed in it, when you're in a particular culture, you imagine those things that define it for you, that you have that lived experience. You don't think about it analytically necessarily, you sort of live it, and you imagine that to expand often much broader than it is, right? But people in a different area are using that same marker, are identifying with black culture, and you can supplement this for any other type of culture, are imagining it in a very different way, right? Some things can be similar, some things can be different, and this can lead to, and this has led, and Mark Anthony Neal alluded to it, talking about the futility of the black, I think he referred to the futility of the black is, black ain't debates that occurred in the 60s. So this is all related to the way that authenticity in hip hop is problematized. But at the end of this lecture, or maybe the end of Wednesday's lecture, I want to get to the fact that even though there are these very important critiques of authenticity, I want to sort of advocate for this counter-hegemonic position that, according to my point of view, and maybe it's a minority point of view among academics, not among people who identify as hip-hoppers, but among academics, sort of a minority point of view, that there still is something important about asserting hip-hop authenticity. So that's where I'm going with my argument. Maybe you'll agree, maybe you won't at the end, we'll see. But first, I do want you to understand why drawing these borders around culture in the way that we tend to do, so I'm going to say unthinkingly, so easily, is problematic, right? That's the point that I want to get across here. All right, so we've been talking about culture. So I went from race and ethnicity, and I've argued that race is not defined by culture. I've argued in the previous lecture it's not defined by biology, and it's not defined by culture. Now I'm expanding more on the argument that race is not defined by culture, whereas ethnicity generally is, not exclusively, because there's often this concept of lineage, but this is one distinction I'm making in terms of ethnicity and race, and I'm saying generally speaking, not that there aren't exceptions, generally speaking, ethnic names, ethnic monikers come from within that ethnicity, whereas race is something that is ascribed. Doesn't come from within a community, doesn't represent doesn't grow out of a shared culture, a shared way of life. But then the question is, what does race have to do with culture? Does race have anything to do with culture? And in fact, it does. So let's talk about what culture is. And culture, like all these terms that we've been talking about, is used in many different ways. And what I've been saying to you since the beginning of this class is that you should be critical about your definitions, and you should use the type of definition which aligns with your politics. If your politics are such that you believe we live in a world which is characterized by injustice, if you believe that rights, opportunities, and resources are distributed in an unfair way, in an unjust way, then you want to have I know you guys are copying these slides down, which is fine. I told you I'll share you these slides. Nothing wrong with copying these down, but don't be copying them down at the expense of not hearing what I'm saying, because what I'm saying to you is going to be, you're going to be tested on. But I forgot what I was saying, because I was thinking about the slides. You see how that happens? Where was I? What was I saying? Yeah, choose your definitions according with your politics. It's just, I'm like a broken record. I keep saying that. But that makes you know, anything that somebody keeps repeating, it's going to be on the exam. Picking your definitions. And I'm saying if you think that this is a socially unjust world, right, which is probably a precondition for you taking this course, not necessarily, but I would imagine so. Then my argument to you is you want to think critically about definitions, and you want to think about how the definitions that you've been given have been constructed to justify and reify the existing relations of power that exist in society. And so if you want to change the way the world is, then you have to be critical about your definitions. Okay, so here are generally the way culture is talked about, right? It's like a whole way of life, or it's the highest ideals of a people or civilization. Sometimes it's referred to as like the best that's ever been written and painted, whatever. And the common error, what we try to avoid in cultural studies, is this concept of cultural essentialism, right? Which is falsely believing that cultures are discretely and naturally bounded. So it's analogous to racial essentialism, imagining that races are defined by some inherent properties of people who belong to that race. False. Same with this, cultural essentialism. And later I'm going to talk about individual essentialism, which is, I claim, the essentialism that liberalism is based on. I'll tell you what it is now. I'll put it up on the board later. But just because we're on the topic, individual essentialism is the axiomatic basis of liberalism. Axiomatic just means there's no argument for it. This is sort of the baseline from which the philosophy begins. We take at first principles. We begin with this assumption. The assumption is that there are individuals, that society is composed of individuals. And then we talk about the individual's rights. And what's the basis of liberalism? The beginning is that everybody should be free to do, should have the liberty, this is why it's called liberalism. Everyone should have the liberty to do whatever they want, so long as what? Anybody finish the sentence? You guys know? Exactly. Everybody should have the liberty to do whatever they want. They shouldn't have to be, subject to somebody else's ideas of religion, somebody else's ideas of social organization, somebody else's ideas of right and wrong. They should be free to do whatever they want, so long as it doesn't impede the liberty of others to do the same. Right? This is the basis of liberalism. Sounds pretty attractive. The problem with it, or the philosophical conundrum, is that it assumes that society is just composed of individuals without realizing that that it is society itself which creates the individual. Just as society is composed of individuals, just as individuals create society, society creates individuals. If that sounds confusing, let me put it to you in a way that might sound a little bit simpler, is that there is no concept of the individual that is coherent without the concept of society, right? So if you are raised on a desert island, but you raise yourself on a desert island, I don't know how you would do that. You raise yourself on a desert island without any society ever, you're not an individual. Because the individual is a concept that only makes sense when contrasted with the concept of society, and vice versa, right? But liberalism doesn't recognize that. And this is why liberalism is essentialist about the concept of the individual. All right, so that's just sort of a It's good for you to know. If you didn't absorb it all, I'm going to get to it later. But it's related to all the stuff that we've been talking about, and it's certainly related to why, which we learned at the beginning of the semester, liberal rights only extend so far as negative rights, right? So your right in the liberal sense, your right to life, only includes your right not to be killed by somebody. But it doesn't include the right to be kept alive by society, because society is not a coherent concept in liberalism, right? And that's a big problem for those of us who are advocating social justice, because we want your rights to include the positive rights, for you to not just have this right in the negative sense, but for you to have the opportunity and the resources to materialize that right in reality. But that requires the responsibility of society. That requires understanding that the individual is not coherent without society, and vice versa. All right. I don't know if you're seeing how this is relating to cultural essentialism, but it does. Let's keep going. Okay, in cultural studies, which is, this class is in African cultural studies. So this is sort of the vantage from which I'm coming, and disciplines are like genres, and they have their theoretical perspectives. And when you study, you can study the same topic from different disciplinary vantages, and there's different assumptions that are made. I just gave you the assumption, the base assumption from which liberalism comes at things. So if you're looking at things from the discipline, you could think of the political philosophy of liberalism as a kind of discipline, as a subdiscipline of philosophy. Then you would be beginning with this core assumption that the individual is fundamental, right? But because we're in cultural studies, our core theoretical paradigm is this notion of cultural hegemony. And what cultural studies seeks to do is to avoid cultural essentialism, which I've just been talking about, and to understand the relationship between culture and politics. So rather than thinking that culture is just, this set of shared traditions that a nation shares, or a people share, or an ethnicity share, we're thinking about it in terms of how I'll show you on the next slide. We're thinking about it in terms of cultures as the frameworks by which groups attribute meaning to the social and material world. I know you guys love copying slides, so I'll give you a minute to copy this slide here. What slide are we on? I might end early today. I don't know if you guys are going to object to that. I might actually end a couple minutes early. Unless you stage a protest and a sit-in. Stage a sit-in, then I'll keep talking. Stage a walkout, I won't keep talking. Sit-in. If you take a knee, I don't know what I'll do in that case. It's obvious in the other two situations, I don't know. Maybe that's for me to be silent. So, in cultural studies, right, this is how we're looking at culture. Not in the essentialist way. We're looking at it as fundamentally imbricated with politics. We're looking at it as the framework by which groups attribute meaning to the social and material world. We're thinking about culture as something that frames and explains and justifies particular social arrangements. And when we're talking about cultural objects, right, we'll look at a particular cultural object and we'll ask about what is the meaning that's attributed to it, and how does it fit into this broader system of meaning that is what? That is framing, explaining, and justifying particular social arrangements, right? And therefore, if it's justifying certain social arrangements, what else is it doing? It's delegitimating others, right? Suggesting that certain social relations are appropriate and others are not, right? This is what culture does. And culture makes it seem normal, appropriate, right, defines right and wrong, defines what's obvious, defines what is common sense, right? We all know that. Everybody knows this is common sense. But what is common sense, right? Common sense is that which you don't need to argue for because everybody already assumes it, because it is a particular meaning which has been embedded in your culture to the extent that you can take it at face value, right? Everybody assumes it to be true. But these assumptions, of course, carry politics, which we don't debate, and we don't debate them because they've been reified into a cultural object. So cultural objects are shared significance embodied in form. What is a cultural object? This is actually on your syllabus. My CD is a cultural object, right? Anything people ascribe, anything people socially ascribe meaning to, right? Beyond its basic use value, right? So I'll give you an example of that. We refer to this as a phone, right? We say smartphone, so we're modifying it to some degree. But generally, we're like, where's my phone, right? But when we're talking about the phone has particular use value. The use value is to make and receive calls. But some phones have a prestige attached to them, right? Over and above all the cool stuff, I can use this as a, clicker. Awesome advances in technology. I can use it as a clicker. It's changed my world. But it can have, some places I go, especially when I travel to the third world, right? I've got a Note 8 here. You guys aren't impressed that I have a Note 8. But like when I was just in Trinidad and people are like, wow, that's a nice phone, right? Because people who have this phone in other places where it's harder to have a phone like this, the phone has more than its use value meaning. The phone then has a meaning of social class attached to it, right? A meaning of prestige that has been attached to it, right? Over and above. And in the Brian Barry book, when he was talking about, this is positional goods, when he was talking about positional goods, in a section that I told you about, you didn't read, but he used the example of SUVs, right? So a sport utility vehicle, in theory, has been designed, has been created for people, to have the utility, utility of doing sports, right? You're supposed to throw your skis in it, throw your, whatever your sports paraphernalia is, go out and do your sports, right? But then it became this thing, or Hummers, even better, even funnier example, right? Hummers became a status symbol. I don't think they're that hot right now, so they're not in, But there was a period when like a Hummer, which was a military vehicle, right? It was supposed to be taking fire. That's why you have a Hummer. But for some reason, it was like, the cool thing to have a Hummer. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a Hummer. First time, I guess, probably everybody's been in a Hummer now. It wasn't a big deal. But first time I was in a Hummer was when it was a big deal. And I got in it, and I was like, it's so big on the outside, and it's so tiny on the inside. It's garbage, right? It's like the opposite of these little cube cars, which look terrible from the outside, and then you go in and you're like, oh, I wouldn't mind having one of these. It's like, it's magical. There's all this space in here. So that's got use value. The cube car has use value, not necessarily social prestige value, except I guess in certain circles, right? Hummer is the opposite, right? Not a lot of use value in most of our lives, right? It does have good use value elsewhere, but it has this different cultural value. And the cultural value of a given object is different from different perspectives, right? So we can talk about American culture, but just because, there's a whole bunch of Americans doesn't mean they all share the same culture. Maybe there are some assumptions that they share and others that they don't, right? So depending on your class position, depending on your, there's all kinds of things that, you imagine a Venn diagram that make your particular cultural position distinct from somebody else's, who, from the outside, people might assume that, so somebody from Senegal might look at you guys, and if there's, 6 of you who are all American, they might be like, yeah, well, you guys, you Americans, you think like this, I saw you on TV, and this is, what you think a Hummer means, right? And that might be true for some of you and not others, right? Some of you might think it's ostentatious and bullshit to have a Hummer, or whatever, I don't know, a Bugatti. Let's talk about Bugatti, right? Let's update the shit. And other people might think it's absurd. Other people might think it's dope. Anybody got a Bugatti? You got? That's okay. You don't have to identify yourselves. We can hang out after. Shared significance embodied in form. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 more slides. So I'll define culture in this way, right? Frameworks by which groups attribute meaning to the social and material world. So now let's talk about mainstream culture versus counterculture, right? Or counter-hegemonic culture. Use my favorite word, right? Easing you into this hegemonic stuff. What is mainstream culture, right? It's promoted through official channels, through mainstream channels, and generally justifies the dominant social order, right? The dominant order. Counterculture circulates through alternative sources, not necessarily the official sources, but surreptitiously through official sources. I put that, highlighted that for a reason, italicized that for a reason. And dissents from the dominant social order. Now I'm using these words very, very precisely, right? Counterculture and dissent. Dissent is not always resistance. Sometimes countercultures, even though they dissent from mainstream culture, they are not necessarily a fundamental challenge to it. There's lots of countercultures that reify, that replicate, that perpetuate the mainstream order, the dominant culture, even as they sort of dissent from it. But there are other countercultures which fundamentally challenge dominant culture, right? Do you have questions about this? I'm hearing like whispers and comments. Do we have a question or a comment about this? No? Racial blackness, ethnic blackness. We don't need to go over the slide. If you want to check it out, I just put this up as a piece of literature that talks about how there's this greater ethnic diversity among black people than is generally recognized. Greg Tate is a novelist and a journalist, a hip-hop journalist. And he wrote this book called Flyboy and the Buttermilk. Okay, so I'm gonna end on this slide. So this is where we're going to for next week, right? For Wednesday. So the ubiquity of hip-hop authenticity. So I'm just pointing out what I have on this side of the slide here is just pointing out to you all these sort of slogans, these tropes, these ways that authenticity is constantly referred to in hip-hop. Right? It's ubiquitous in rap lyrics, right? So the question is why? Why is it so important? And what we're going to talk about is how the concept of authenticity, which again, this is in your readings, the concept of authenticity is linked both to the concept of race, right? Specifically, hip-hop authenticity as linked to black authenticity. It's also linked to class. Specifically spaces, right? The hood, the ghetto, urban, which sometimes is a euphemism, another way for people to say black when they are not allowed to say black or don't want to or whatever. Sometimes it makes no sense to be using urban, in that context. But it's funny to see, people doing that kind of thing. And then it's also related, when I say related to class, also related to commercialism and a critique of commercialism, right? And that's related to the black arts aesthetic from the 60s, the black arts movement, and the concern, co-optation. It's a new word I just invented a few seconds ago, and I realized I mistyped, but now let's call it a new term. I'll make up a definition for it by next Wednesday. Co-optation is what I meant to write. I did it twice. No, definitely we're going to have to Freudian slip. White co-optation. That's something right there. White co-optation. Quote me on that shit. Yeah, the concern about co-optation, right? That's, of course, going to lead past Wednesday. We're going to go next week. We're talking about appropriation, right? Cultural appropriation. So these are the issues that we're talking about when we talk about hip-hop authenticity. And what I want you to think about is, given all these critiques that you've got in the readings, why would we as hip-hoppers, those of us who identify as hip-hoppers, why do we want to hold on to the notion of authenticity when it's problematized in all these different kinds of ways, right? And the hint is, why would we want to hold on to an idea of blackness or an idea of Chicano-ness or Chicana-ness or womanness when we're challenging sexism? Why do we want to hold on to these things if, in fact, they are social constructs that have been created for our oppression? What would be the point, right? But there is a point. So we'll talk about that on Wednesday.